Okay, well, we have a lot to cover today, so I'll get started. Thank you so much for everyone for showing up on time. My name is Dimitri Broxton. I'm the Senior Director of Education at Museum of the African Diaspora in San Francisco, and we're really excited to be able to provide this course for you. It's something we've been dreaming about for years, and the opportunity to go beyond our four walls of the museum and bring this course to folks all over the world right now is really exciting for us. Um, I want to thank I want to thank IMLS, the Institute for Museum and Library Services, who is the funder for this program. We couldn't do it without them. We've had such support from them since the beginning. And I want to thank my esteemed guest, Jacqueline Francis, for agreeing to do this program. And when we shifted to the digital sphere, moving it to an online platform. So I'm going to jump right in and introduce Jacqueline Francis. I have a strong feeling that everyone knows who she is, and I don't really need to do an introduction, but a reminder of the greatness who we're able to share this next hour and a half with. So Dr. Jacqueline Francis is the author of Making Race, Modernism, and Racial Art in America, published in 2012, and the co-editor of Romare Bearden, American Modernist, in 2011. I should also say that she is the chair of Graduate Visual and Critical Studies program and the associate professor, History of Art and Visual Culture program at California College of the Arts. With Marianne Kahlo, Francis is working on a new book about African-American artists' participation in a federally funded arts program of the 1930s and their impact on the emergent US art markets of the 1940s. She has published articles on contemporary artists, Olivia Moll, Joan Jonas, Andrea Fraser, Carrie James Marshall, and with Tina Takemoto, David Hammonds, and on the topic of fair use. Among her many museum catalog essays are those on Alma Thomas from the Columbus Museum of Art in Georgia and Chrysler Museum of Art, which is forthcoming in 2021. Bob Thompson, Colby College Museum of Art, forthcoming also in 2021. And Romare Bearden, the Museum of Modern Art, in 2019. Micheline Thomas, Seattle Art Museum in 2018, and Ralph Arnold, Museum of Contemporary Photography, Chicago, 2018. In 2019, Francis was the Paul Mellon Guest Scholar at the Center for Advanced Study in the Visual Arts at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. During the 2016 to 17 academic year, Francis was the Robert A. Corrigan Professor in Social Justice in the College of Ethnic Studies at San Francisco State University. She presently serves on the advisory board of the journal Third Text, Critical Perspectives on Contemporary Art and Culture, and of San Francisco's Root Division Gallery and the Luggage Store Gallery. She is the board president of the Queer Cultural Center, a multimedia resource and advocacy site for LGBT artistic expression in San Francisco. She is former member of the College Art Association's Board of Directors, serving from 2009 to 14, and currently chairs CAA's nominating committee. With Kathy Czar, Francis co-curated the art exhibitions Where Is Here for Museum of the African Diaspora, October 2016 to May 2017, and Side by Side in the World for the San Francisco Art Commission's main gallery. This fall, Francis curated A Matter of Time, new work by Adia Millet for Galerie du Monde in Hong Kong, which actually runs through, was taken down on January 10th. She's a member of the 3 Point Art Collective and serves the occasional, and actually creates the occasional visual art object, which is something new to me. And Jackie, you're gonna have to show me some of those works. She exhibited work in group shows at Southern Exposure, the Kat Snyder Gallery of the Jewish Community Center of San Francisco, and Outlook and the Birth of the Queer at the GLBT History Museum. She's a recipient of a 2017 to 18 Individual Arts Commission from the San Francisco Arts Commission for work on a collection of short stories. Without further ado, it is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Jacqueline Francis.
Thank you so much, Dimitri, for that extensive introduction and for having me here to be part of the MOAD programming during this important month. I always say that the month between January 15, that is a long month through Black History Month, is an especially important time for those of us who are of African descent, to say nothing of those of us who are interested in it in general. I want to thank, of course, Sade, who's also here with us tonight, checking in on the chat, and of course, all the MOAD team in terms of the marketing, as well as just managing the programming during this very challenging time. It's so cool to see folks from around California and from across the country. As Dimitri mentioned, I'm here in San Francisco, which is the unceded and traditional land of the Ramaytush Ohlone people who have continuously lived upon this land from time immemorial. And I just want to honor both those ancestors as well as their descendants in the present. I also want to start off because especially today is a really tumultuous day for a lot of different reasons, with a little bit of a focusing exercise to kind of bring myself down and get centered and focused for the time we're going to have together. And there will be a break. We won't go for 90 minutes without cessation. We'll probably have a break sometime around the 40-minute mark, just a little bio break and chance to move around. But let's start off with something that focuses on our attention. I think this would be really good, considering that we're going to be talking about visual objects tonight, albeit ones that we can't touch, much less see in person, but maybe it'll make us think about using our eyes. So what I'd like to do is invite everybody to find something in the space wherever you are right now that's blue, and just to sit there and look at it for 10 seconds. Something that's blue. Now find something that's red. Anything that's red or reddish. Now find something that's white. Now find something that's black. Now something that's green. And now just to shift your brain a little bit, find something in the room that looks rough, uneven, splintery, textured, that looks rough. Now find something that looks soft, pillowy, mushy, maybe gel-like. Now find something that looks slick. Cool. How was that for folks? You can pop your answers, how that worked for you, into the chat. And Dimitri, could we have the opening slide for the introduction PowerPoint?
Just give me 1 second.
Great. Super. So yeah, that's an exercise that one of my colleagues who works at California College of the Arts here in the Bay Area introduced to me. She works with people who do uh, graphic novels, comics, and animation. And she also has worked as someone who's an actor and does improvisational presentations. So that's a really kind of organizing and grounding exercise to kind of bring us wherever we are. And as I said, I also think it's a good way to think about the visual, even though we'll be listening tonight as well as seeing. And literally, you know, as someone who's working as an art historian, to not only think about the content of the things that we'll be discussing tonight, but to think about how they're made, even though we're not seeing them in real life. We're looking at JPEGs, we're looking at screenshots, to just think about the ways that artists manipulate line and color, form, volume, shape, texture, rhythms, the way that artists make things that help us understand what ideas they're communicating to us. The other thing that I hope we can do in addition to visual analysis is also to think about historical contextualization, like when things were made, where they were made, who made them, and maybe a little bit about why they made them as well. So to really situate objects in the time of their making, as well as the time in which we're looking at them and experiencing them here in the present, January 20th, 2021. And then the third thing, in addition to visual analysis and historical contextualization, is that I'll be, you know, thinking about the historiography behind some of these objects. That is to say, what have writers, what have art historians, what have other people written and said about these projects, these creative projects? And I'll throw out some names tonight, and they'll be on the slides. So maybe that if you want to do external and extra reading, these can be resources for you. And of course, I want to say too, before we get much further, is that I know a lot of people on this call, and it's such an honor and it's such a thrill to have you join me tonight. As I was telling Dimitri and Sadeh, I know a lot of you know a lot about what we're talking about tonight as curators, as writers, as artists, as scholars, as collaborators with any of the previously mentioned people. So please ask questions throughout. Don't wait for a Q&A. Put your comments in the chat. Sadeh and I will be looking at them, as well as ask me if you need me to stop and explain something differently, or if something you want me to go back to an image. So let's go to the next slide, Dimitri. Dimitri's going to help me tonight with slides. So, you know, really, I think appropriate to the fact that here we are at a program that is organized by the Museum of the African Diaspora, which is, of course, a landmark institution that really brings the historical construct of the African diaspora to the public through discussions about art and music, performance, and any number of different ways of expressive culture, not only in terms of the history of the African diaspora, but also in terms of creating visibility for the contemporary phenomenon. That I think diaspora is a key term for us as we think about art and artists of the African diaspora, and as the description online also said, of the Black Atlantic. But let's look at this term diaspora. Let's go to the next slide, Dimitri. So we can advance, just hit, this term diaspora comes from a Greek term, diasporein, which means to disperse. That is to say, to fling things about, to spread and scatter things. And I think we want to think about not only in terms of dispersion of people and a group of people who are seen as homogenous, but a dispersion of people's languages and culture, or both. And so when we speak about diaspora, we don't necessarily think about just one person, that is to say, getting on a plane and moving from one place to another. Instead, we're thinking about a mass movement of people, a great number of people. That's what we're thinking about in this terms of this historical context of diaspora, and even certainly into the present. So historical examples, Jews being forced out of Israel, being forced out of Jerusalem in the 6th century BCE, before the Christian era, and exiled to Babylonia, which is today's Iraq and Syria. And of course, next one is the Africans who were captured and taken from Africa, forced into slavery from the 1500s in Europe, and brought to the Americas, brought to Europe, brought to the Americas and to Asia. And before we go on to the next slide, I just want to say these are maps. And I know that especially in terms of the kind of last 18 months we've had, even maybe some visualizations of this dispersion of people of African descent might trigger some feelings of distress, and even sadness. So I just want to say that I'm going to show you a couple of maps. So the next one, Dimitri, the next slide. Great. So, you know, one of the things that I wanted to point out in terms of the historical slave trade, in terms of people of African descent, yes, to Kalandra in the chat, that people were also trafficked to the Asian Peninsula. And you can see here in terms of this map of the Indian Ocean African slave trade from 1500 to 1900, that people were taken into what is now contemporary India, Sri Lanka, around the Saudi Peninsula, and also people were taken, as we'll see in a moment too, across the Sahara into the Mediterranean as well. So again, just to show you of this sort of dispersion of people of African descent from the eastern part of the continent. And yes, Rula in the chat making a comment, Palestinians forced to flee in 1948 and 1967, also diaspora. Do other people have diasporas that are meaningful, or that they have studied, that they also want to bring into the discussion? Thank you, Rula, and thank you, Kalandra, for bringing in these questions. Jews from Spain in the 1400s. Yep, thank you, Narda. Dispersion from Hurricane Katrina, people having to leave New Orleans and the other parts of Louisiana, going to Houston, fantastic. Also the dispersion of Irish people during the 19th century potato famine, which wasn't just about people being hungry, but about the way in which agriculture was being controlled as part of the British Empire. Yep, great. I see Muslims to Spain in the 8th century. Thank you so much. People in Puerto Rico, Tibetans, yep. Pakistan and Indian people during the partition, Japanese to Hawaii and South America, exactly. Jewish diaspora is something that Danielle says that she studied in literature. Puerto Ricans in the 1940s, and yes, after Maria, great. So yeah, so we're understanding, I think, the Rohingya, right now, exactly in what used to be Burma and is now Myanmar, great. Are diasporas always forced without the choice of the dispersed? Great question from Amr. Yes, there are the questions of voluntary diasporas as opposed to involuntary diasporas. So of course, in terms when we're thinking of the historical diasporas, like some of the ones that many of you have mentioned in this in the chat already, in terms of people of African descent, people on the Indian Peninsula, the Rohingya, Jews being forced out of Israel in the before Christian era times, yes, that these are forced diasporas. But then we're also talking about voluntary diasporas, that is to say, mass movements of people who are making a decision based on usually the opportunities as they see them for economic betterment and maybe even for safety. I saw somebody mention the Great Migration, which some scholars have talked about as being a phenomenon that is often framed in terms of the early 20th century, when you see the images of people on trains and driving and walking out of the South and going into the upper South, Virginia, going into the Midwest, St. Louis, going up further in the Midwest to Chicago, and then also going to New York. And of course, there's the diaspora where people from Louisiana and Texas came out here to California and to the West Coast. Native Americans from their traditional lands. So those would be forced diasporas, like the Trail of Tears, as opposed to voluntary diasporas, where people are also making decisions to move, but out of their own volition. And it's a really complicated story because sometimes when we're talking about diasporas that are seemingly voluntary, that is to say, people are buying tickets on a boat or buying tickets for plane travel or driving or walking, etc. Exactly as Remy just said, people in the 1950s from the Caribbean going to England for work. That's a great example of what I was about to say, which is, as was the case with people from the Caribbean who came into the US as voluntary migrants at the turn of the 20th century, in the late 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. Those in Britain, those who went to Britain in 1948, the Windrush generation, were also recruited to come to England, just like the Guadeloupeans and the Martinicans were recruited to come to North America to work. And then when they got there, in both cases, people faced a lot of discrimination. And even though they had been invited to migrate, invited to immigrate, there was always this question of, do you belong and will you be treated fairly, equitably, and with dignity? So these are really great questions around diasporas and diasporic movement, voluntary and involuntary. Yes, I see the one from someone who's talking about people moving from Turkey to Greece and then Greece from Turkey in 1923. Yeah, great examples. Latin America to California. California was Mexico in the 19th century. So I always think it's an interesting thing to think about. You know, the different ways that the nation state can kind of construct diaspora. Tiffany interned Japanese Americans during World War II, resettling to states that they moved out of. Great. The English sent to Australia. Great. Terrific. All really resonant and really rich examples. And ones to kind of think through as we're talking about people of the African diaspora tonight. Dimitri, let's go to the next slide. It's also a map. So yeah, so in terms of oftentimes what we see in terms of the African diaspora, the historical ones, we often see this map which dramatically presents the numbers of people who are moving from the West African side, the western part of the continent, and going to the Americas, going to South America, Brazil in great numbers, coming into the Caribbean in also large numbers, and then also coming up into North America, to the United States, what would become the United States. And I also draw your attention to the numbers of people who were moving across the Sahara, going to North Africa. As I mentioned before, many of those people didn't stay in the North African nations that, you know, would now be, you know, Morocco, Tunisia, Libya. They would also be trafficked to the Mediterranean, that is to say, Italy, Greece, the southern part of Spain, and the southern part of France. So thinking about some of the early examples, and we can go to the next slide, Dimitri. Just hold it on the blank space for this moment. You don't have to click quite yet. In terms of the numbers, they have been estimated that 12 to 12.8 million Africans were captured and shipped across the Atlantic and enslaved in the Americas during the historical slave trade, as it was called. And the estimates they vary between 1.2 and 2.4 million people perished during the voyage alone, during the ocean passage, and in seasoning camps where people were literally broken down, tortured, humiliated, sexually assaulted and abused in order to prepare them for a life of enslavement in North America. There are numbers of people, that is to say, the vast range of people who were estimated to perish during the ocean voyage of 1.2 to 2.4 million. That's at least 4% of the captured Africans dying during this time called the Middle Passage. As some of you know, the major Atlantic slave trading nations were the Portuguese, the British, the Spanish, the French, the Dutch, and the Danish. And some of these nation states had established trading posts on the African coastline where they purchased slaves from African leaders who were often at war with the groups that they would be facilitating the capture of and turning over of these people to these slaving nations. In terms of the first known transatlantic slave ship was said to have sailed from Africa, from Sao Tome off the coast of Africa to New Spain in 1525. And obviously to underscore the complexity of the trade in African bodies, this transatlantic slave ship was purportedly banked by Italian bankers in Genoa who paid the Spanish court to facilitate this movement of African people. The Portuguese had what was considered a monopoly on the export of slaves or enslaving people from Africa until about 1640. And then in the second half of the 17th century, the Dutch, the British, and the French caught up to their Portuguese competitors. And they concentrated their trade in enslaved Black people, enslaved Africans to the Caribbean islands, to Curacao, to Martinique and Barbados. And even from there, people would be exported into the North American mainland. One other bit of factual evidence or factual accounting, it's said that during the 18th century that the slave trade transported 6 million Africans. The British alone carried almost 2.5 million of those enslaved people from Africa to places across the world. Many of you, I'm wondering how many people have followed the 1619 project that the New York Times launched 2 years ago to mark the 400th anniversary of enslaved people being brought from Africa into the United States. Yeah, phenomenal project, extraordinary project. Some of it, yeah. Do people remember any particulars about that? Where those folks landed in 1619? So yeah, 1619 people, Virginia, great, Dimitri, thank you. Bing, bing, bing. So people were brought to Virginia and they landed at a spot called Point Comfort in what was then still the British colony of Virginia. That's 1619, but they even think that African slaves had been brought into Spanish Florida as early as 1526. So that's amazing when we think back that even before 1619, that there were Africans who had been enslaved brought into what was then Spanish-controlled Florida in 1526. So the first slide here, let's look at somebody that many people might know. I know that when I was in grade school, I saw this image more than once. Does anybody recognize this subject here? Yes, Adam, bing, 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 Phyllis Wheatley, yes, Angelica, yes, M. Talabi, Miss Mikael, yes, Kalandra, yes, right. So what do we know about Phyllis Wheatley just by looking at this image of her? Is that she was known as a poet, writer, excellent Veronica Jackson, exactly. Suzette, yes. So Wheatley was born what we think is in West Africa, either Senegal or Gambia in around 1753, and then brought to Boston, where she lived until 1784. That was the year of her death. Marish has just read some of her writing. Yeah, so Wheatley known for her poets, her sonnets, Mikael, exactly. Fluent in Greek, Latin, English, and native African languages. Fantastic. So this is quite astonishing that even in a time when the trade in African slaves is going on, that there is this woman who is not only writing poetry, but whose writings are being published. And again, some of you who might know about her from other contexts might know, why is this happening, right? It's happening because people who are certainly abolitionists, and even others who may not have totally inflected abolition politics, were trying to say that, yes, Black people, African people, people of African descent, write, speak, think, have creative thoughts, as if already in the time of Phyllis Wheatley in the 18th century, that had to be argued and it had to be shown. It had to be demonstrated. And literally people would watch and try to make sure, they would try to demonstrate by watching her write that no, someone else wasn't writing for her. She was in fact the author of these poems, as if this was an astonishing discovery. The next slide. Thank you, Dimitri. So another well-known author here, Ignatius Oloadua Equiano, who was also an 18th century writer here, and we're looking at his publication where he talked about his origins, which he said he was born in southern Nigeria. Some of you might know that there's been some controversy about whether he was born in Nigeria or actually born in South Carolina to enslaved African parents. But certainly, above all, what his narrative talks about is this journey from enslavement to being able to be a free man, and certainly to become a published author. And then thirdly is, finally, if we can hit the slide, Dimitri, is Ignatius Sancho, also a published author in the 18th century. Like Equiano, Sancho ended up in London. He was born in 1729, and purportedly he was born actually on a ship transporting enslaved people from Africa to Europe. He was an active letter writer, and 2 years after his death in London, these letters of his were published in 1782. So I'm just bringing out these examples. I see something from Mary. Okay, about the blank white slides. Yep. That's going to be tough throughout. There's going to be a lot of white slide backgrounds. Well, I'll take note of this. Thank you, Mary, for that comment about the white background. But to get back to the point about these authors, again, is to think about their fortunes. That is to say, how they're doing as people of African descent who are being recognized for their skills as writers. And then think about the vast number of people who were enslaved, working brutal hours, their torture, their abuse, and increasingly, right, they're literally just the exploitation, which is almost hard to imagine, much less to articulate. Next slide, please, Dimitri. I just wanted to show you some photographs here by a white American named Augustus F. Sherman, who was a clerk, an official at Ellis Island in the late 19th century and early part of the 20th century. And Sherman was a self-taught photographer who was interested in documenting new arrivals to America. And I'm just showing you these images of people coming from Guadeloupe and Martinique, because when we talked a little bit before about people coming voluntarily, these people were leaving their homes in the Caribbean to come to North America, some just stopping at Ellis Island and then going on to Canada. Which makes sense when you think about, in terms of Guadeloupe and Martinique, that they were French-speaking colonies, and that perhaps many of these people ended up in Quebec. So often when we think of Ellis Island, we often only think about European people arriving there, but even in the early part of the 20th century, there were people from the African continent, or coming from the Caribbean, I should say, and some people from the African continent as well. Hit the advance button, please, Dimitri. What I'm showing you now is that these photographs by Augustus Sherman have become so iconic, is that people have started to make new work based on them. That is to say, at the top left here, you're seeing some color photography by a contemporary artist named Marina Amaral, and you can search her online. She takes historical photographs and then treats them to bring them into color. And it's such an extraordinary thing that she's doing. It's not unlike colorizing film, but the fact that she's chosen not only immigrants coming through Ellis Island, but immigrants who are Black. Her name is Marina, M-A-R-I-N-A, and her last name is Amaral, A-M-A-R-A-L. And that she's selling these color-treated historical photographs online is just amazing to me, that these are things that have become not just aestheticized, but also in some ways decorative because of the color treatment. I don't know, how do people feel about color treatment of films that were made in black and white? Does anybody have strong feelings? Thank you, Antoinette. Veronica Jackson, sacrilege. No for me, says Calandra. Ellen Welsh, sometimes good, sometimes bad. Brings it to the contemporary, but these photos are lovely. Darlene says, nope. I love the option to view it different ways. Yeah. Yeah, it's quite stark to see them. Well, here's something even more to think about. Dimitri, could you advance just once? So in terms of this group that was photographed by Sherman in 1911 at Ellis Island, now you can see that there are masks being made. Here we are in the age of COVID that has the image of these Guadeloupean women on the mask, which is astonishing. I mean, I literally was gathering images today and then I saw these and I was like, whoa, that is something in our era to think of. That's what these masks mean, and that someone will be able to read them. Someone will be able to look at these images translated onto fabric and know that not only are they historical, but maybe even know that there were these historical people who came through Ellis Island from Guadeloupe. And I can even top that. Hit the next slide, Dimitri. Thank you. Now even on your coffee, tea, or soup mug. How What do people think about that? Oh dear, says Tiffany. Dimitri says. Yeah, uncomfortable, says Mikael. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and we don't know the names of these women. Janet says so American. Ula says it's exploitive. Yeah, our ancestor returning. Yeah. Who owns the image? Yeah. And there are these images now, in the public domain. Yeah. Yeah. So food for thought, I think. And again, yeah, that's the thing about these kinds of projects is that I always feel like that I love art that makes me think, even if it makes me mad. I wouldn't maybe live with some of the art that makes me really mad. I'm not saying that these things are, but I just really think about it in terms of the sort of commercialization of these images. So that brings us to another key word in addition to diaspora. Let's go to the next slide, please. Culture. So what do we mean when we talk about culture? Well, here's another word. And if we can hit the slide, Dimitri, that comes from antiquity through French and then eventually to Latin cultura. And we can hit the slide again. Dimitri, thank you. Culture, in terms of its Latin roots, meant to inhabit, to grow, protect, to honor with worship. So, we might think about cultured bacterias, we might think about cultured slides, we might think about cultivating in terms of growing. Maybe we don't often think about culture as something to be protected, but that is at the very root of the idea of curation. To curate means to protect something, to protect art objects, to protect ideas, to protect other things that are seen as precious, and maybe in some ways to inhabit them. On the next slide. So this idea of culture then, in terms of protection, we could really think about it in terms of the very context of property, whether that property is crops and animals to cherished ideas or our deeply seated values. And culture, of course, is always situated in a particular place, a society at a particular time and at a particular geography. And we can see, even just thinking back to the images that we just looked at in terms of the women coming from the Caribbean, the way that Sherman's photographs of them and the photographs as cultural object, as documentation, have now translated into another kind of cultural object, that is to say the mask as well as the mug. So in the contemporary world, we can think about culture in terms of this meaning of owning things, in terms of caring for things, cultural property, in terms of music, in terms of literature, in terms of dance, in terms of the visual arts. And then the final bit on this idea in terms of 20th and 20th century multiculturalist frameworks. The late anthropologist Terence Turner had argued in one of his publications that culture, and we can hit the next slide, Dimitri, becomes merged with singular ethnic identities. And so this is going to be, something that we'll be thinking about, I think, tonight and in subsequent meetings, is to say, what culture, what things, and the boundaries around both the people as well as the objects or the property. The next bullet point. So Turner also talked about cultures being considered discrete by overemphasizing their boundedness. So what Turner was thinking about is, can people really say that, one culture stops here and another culture starts on the other side of the boundary? We could literally think about it in terms of territory. When you're traveling across the globe and you're going from one nation state to another, where, you might have a different visa stamp. If you're on the border between Senegal and the Gambia, do certain things that are produced and made in Senegal stop being Senegalese when you go over to the Gambia? Do certain things in Italy stop being Italian when you go north to Austria, right? Because culture doesn't look at maps. Culture doesn't often look at boundaries that are geographical and political markers. Culture just moves. And then the last thing from Turner, that cultures become badges of group identity. And of course, that's what we're really talking about when we talk about things like cultural property, we're talking about cultural pride, and when we're talking about people borrowing from culture, sometimes without acknowledgement, that's when this idea of the appropriation of culture becomes unnecessarily political and really prickly discussion. So let's look at the next slide. So thinking about cultural groups, cultural production, and of course, cultural distribution. I'm showing you this photograph of Zora Neale Hurston, very well known as a novelist, as a cultural worker, who was interviewing two musicians in Florida in 1935. The photograph was taken by Alan Lomax, also known as a folklorist who traveled across the South during the 1930s, collecting literally songs, recording songs, writing down lyrics. And Hurston, who had been trained as an anthropologist at Columbia, also was interested in this same important work of documenting culture and documenting history and talking to the people who were producing it. If we go to the next slide, please. Some of these folks became very well known as celebrities. Gabriel Brown, who we just saw in the previous photograph by Lomax in 1935, traveled from Florida to New York and was a performer in popular music venues there. And here he's photographed by the white American photographer Carl Van Vechten, who photographed everybody who was anybody that came to New York from the 1930s onward. On the left is a photograph of a publication that Hurston authored in 1934 called Characteristics of Negro Expression. And Dimitri has put the URL in the chat so that you all can see another version of this text, which is such an interesting thing because of the ways in which not only does Hurston mean to say that there's something particular about people who are identified in the US as Negroes, people of African descent, but also the ways in which she talks about them as producers of something that is not just about one form of expression, that is to say, not just about music or not just about literature, but instead that is something that seems to be world changing. So this is something that I would recommend for people to look. You're seeing in terms of the URL that I gave you is about 4 pages long, but something that you could look after class. But just scrolling through it right now, do look at the ways that she gives examples of what she's talking about, like certain expressions that are very visual as she talks about them, things like chop axe, sitting chair, cook pot. And then in the subheadings that she gives you in this essay, there's one I draw your attention to. The first one is called the Will to Adorn. And she talks about the will to adorn is the second most notable characteristic in Negro expression. Perhaps his ideas of ornament does not attempt to meet conventional standards, but it satisfies the soul of the creator. So this is an extremely important statement for Zora Neale Hurston to be offering to her readership in the 1930s. Kill dead. I love that one too. That's one of my favorites. Yeah, they killed me dead, or they killed dead, the emphasis. And then this idea of the will to adorn, whether it's in terms of personal fashion choices, in terms of housing, interior decoration, architectural ornament, what you do in terms of the way you ornament or otherwise aestheticize, even something that's as simple as a car, a vehicle. So these are extraordinary examples that Zora Neale Hurston, who's not only thinking like a novelist in terms of her love for language, metaphor and simile, but also is thinking about describing cultures of African people in rich novelistic language. Had anybody heard of this essay before tonight? Anybody read it before? Seen it before? Yeah, check it out, because Hurston herself was just such a fabulous storyteller as a novelist, and herself as a persona also just seemed always to me a larger than life kind of character, one who would tell you about yourself, as well as sit down after an argument and you could have like a cold glass of something, whether it was a lemonade or an adult beverage, and just tell stories and think about these ideas of both history as well as creative expression. The other thing that's on that slide, and Dimitri, you could close that URL right now, is this documentary about Hurston, in which it's this public TV documentary. It's about 26 minutes, and it talks about Hurston's life and career. Maybe we should have our break and then come back to looking at a little bit of it at about 7 o'clock. How does that sound? Just to have a bio break. Work for everybody? So we're at 5 minutes to the hour, and we'll come back right at the top of the hour. See you in a minute. 5 minutes. Yeah, we can put the link to the video in the chat.
The Florida
I'm doing a little experimentation here, Jackie.
Good, it's all good. It's all good.
Yeah.
Great. So I think we'll start rolling back.
Okay. Are you still seeing my screen with the video?
Yeah, so you
Okay,
can,
perfect.
yeah. So, like I said, the video is about 26 minutes and we're about an hour through tonight's meeting. So maybe we'll just have that as something maybe we can talk about next week. And you all now have the URL for it, but we can come back to it next week so that we can move on to some of the other issues and some of the other artists and events tonight in terms of literally setting up what we're talking about when we speak about diaspora. I want to move on to another um, person who was intervening, that is to say, by studying and by documenting cultures of Black people in the United States. The next slide after this one should be Josephine Harris. So, like uh, uh, Zora Neale Hurston, you know, Harris was is an academic. He's still alive, living in the Washington, D.C. area. And he was a very important organizer in terms of bringing together people across the humanities, that is to say, people in history, people in literature, people in political science, who were interested in thinking about this idea of an African diaspora as a phenomenon that affected the world in terms of economic developments, political developments, historical developments, etc. So he organized conferences at Howard University, as well as in Nairobi. During his tenure as a professor. He's now retired, as I said. And he's also a published author in terms of one of his important books is The Global Dimensions of the African Diaspora, published in 1982. So that might be a title that some of you might be interested in checking out. The next, just to be advanced, Dimitri, I'm showing you the cover of a book by Josephine Holloway, called Africanisms in African Culture, published in 1991. And Professor Holloway, Dr. Holloway, is an active academic still teaching at Cal State Northridge, as far as I can see. And I think for a lot of people who are thinking about, you know, what is it that we expect to find when we think about the African diaspora, oftentimes it's the expectation that you will find something that was exactly as it was in Africa. That is to say, a ritual, a way of making visual art, a way of composing a song or playing it. But one of the things that I try to think about a lot is that I think of these ideas of culture, and certainly African cultures among them, that there's an idea with diaspora is that you may have come with a sort of cultural legacy, and you may come as a cultural producer, and you bring that with you and you carry it on, and yet it is changed by the new circumstance in the place where you have arrived. So in other words, what I think about when I think about diaspora is I think about the dynamism of culture. That is to say that there are things that clearly have roots in a place, and yet as they take root in a new place, take on their particular personality and particular texture and character that is not exactly like the source that often seems as the originary source. The next key term, in addition to culture and diaspora, if we can go to the next slide, Dimitri, is the Black Atlantic. So the Black Atlantic, like diaspora, is this conceptual framework. It's something that people started to sort of write about, think about, lecture on, teach in terms of universities and colleges to talk about the phenomenon of racism and enslavement and enslaving people in slavery, as I put it here, in the formation of Western modernity. So rather than think about the idea of the transatlantic slave trade, even a term that a lot of people question, does it really speak to the racism and oppression when we talk about a slave trade as if we were talking about trading on a market, a stock market. The idea of the Black Atlantic is to really situate the phenomenon of the movement of bodies and goods into the formation of Western modernity. So among the first who were thinking about this, if we can go to the next bullet point, Dimitri, are thinkers, intellectuals, authors, activists that some of you may know, including W.E.B. Du Bois, the American, Eric Williams, the Trinidadian, C.L.R. James, also Trinidadian, and Frantz Fanon from Martinique. And these scholars working in the first part of the 20th century were very much thinking about what was the impact of slavery as an economic force on industrialization from the Industrial Revolution onwards to the emergence of nation states and the rise of capitalism. So not just think about slavery as, quote, the peculiar institution, which historians talked about as early as the 1950s and looking back on the historical slave trade, but to think about how it's absolutely entwined with the rise of the capitalist system that we live with today. If we go on to the next bullet point, Du Bois and James were really interested in terms of thinking about cultural producers, creatives, artists, and others who were making expressive culture in terms of the formation of what has become thought of under this broad tent of Western culture and its institutions, in terms of music, literature, visual art, dance, and other expressive forms. The way that when we think about things in terms of what we see in museums, what we hear on the radio, and what MP3s we listen to, etc. There's some things that seem to be seen only as European in terms of their origins and their formations, but are in fact absolutely influenced, if not seeded, with the work of people of African descent, whether in Africa or outside as part of the diaspora. The next bullet point, please. Dimitri, thank you, which is the last one. Paul Gilroy has been someone who's really invested in thinking about the intellectual foundation of the African diaspora. His book of 1993, and I'm showing you the cover here, is called The Black Atlantic, Modernity and Double Consciousness. So if some of you have read W.E.B. Du Bois, that's his key idea. He talks about double consciousnesses, in terms of the person of African descent in his book, The Soul of Black Folks in 1903. The double consciousness in which one feels split. One recognizes oneself as an American, someone living in the United States, but of course as a person who would, in that day's parlance, be seen as a less than citizen because they were a Negro. And Du Bois talks about that split, and Gilroy picks it up in his title there in terms of double consciousness. And for Gilroy, more so than visual art, the way he sees the Black experience as diasporic, as border crossing, as modern, as modernist, as postmodernist, as transnational and national, despite the narratives that often make whiteness the source of nation state building, and also always puts whiteness at the origins of nation state building in terms of national belonging, in terms of egalitarianism. And those of us who saw things on January 6th can really think deeply about what this means. He puts it into music. He puts it into music as this thing that moves dynamically across borders. I see in the comments here that people are, riffing on. All right, Ricky, you get the the identification question, you can see that Aaron Douglas's work, Building More Stately Mansions, is the cover reproduction for Gilroy's book. And we're going to talk about Douglas in a second as well. And thanks, Kalendra. Yes, Gilroy's book is so good. Highly recommended. Gilroy is a towering intellectual who's written not only in terms of this broad idea of the Black Atlantic and the diaspora, but about working class and Black identity in England. One of his other books is called There Ain't No Black in the Union Jack. I can put that title. That was his first book. I think it must have come out of his PhD dissertation. There Ain't No Black in the Union Jack. Brilliant piece of sociology by Paul Gilroy. So let's look at the hot link in terms of some of the examples that Gilroy uses in his book. If we hit that hot link that says musical Dimitri, and we scroll down, he loves the 80s, 90s soul band that is Soul to Soul. And if we can listen to that song by hitting that hot link there and expanding the screen, that would be great. So I think, we all got our jam on tonight, if for no other reason, to bring that back. You're welcome. You're welcome. And I love everybody telling on themselves. I'm telling myself too. I remember that song when it came out. And I love that people are listening to not only the lyrics, yellow is the color of sun rays. I mean, that's an extraordinary statement too, to hear from people living in England, living in Northern Europe, where at times it's not always bright and sunny, but sometimes cloudy, albeit with plentiful rainfall in places like Ireland and Scotland. But them saying, yes, we're going to embrace that. And also, yes, Soul to Soul, British group. And some people noticed that you also saw not only Black Britons there in the video photography, but also people of clearly other ethnicities. And that really speaks to a generation that Gilroy himself came out of, in which, because of the right-wing movements in Britain from the 1960s onward, racist, xenophobic, that people of color in Britain who were political allies organized themselves under the title Black. So they were embracing the idea of Black Britishness, even as some were of Asian descent, especially of South Asian descent. These are people whose heritages lied on the Indian subcontinent in terms of India and in terms of Pakistan, as well as people from the Caribbean, people from African descent as well. And so, this was a moment of not only political alliance, but bringing the visibility of Black Britons, that is to say, Britons of color, to the fore in terms of music. Yeah, Britain Upriser, people of color, and white Irish. Thank you, Catherine, for that. These alliances have shifted, and some of you may know, because multiculturalism in Britain has become much like multiculturalism in the US, where you, up until recently, you haven't seen these alliances across ethno-racial and socio-cultural divides. Let's move on to the next slide again, to think about dance too. A key figure here, Catherine Dunham, seen as the mother of the study of African diasporic dance forms. So if music was this thing that was dynamic, shifting, and embodied the diasporic experience in terms of the African diaspora to Paul Gilroy, for Catherine Dunham, it was dance and movement. So she's like Zora Neale Hurston, someone born in the United States, but like Hurston, studied social science as a college student. Hurston was at Columbia. Dunham was at the University of Chicago, studied social anthropology and ethnographic study there at UC, got her degree in 1936, and started doing travels to study dance across the African diaspora. Yes, Michael also in terms of African spirituality, part of what she was interested in. She went to Jamaica, where she lived among Maroon communities there. She went to Martinique. She traveled briefly to Trinidad and Tobago, and then she got to Haiti in 1936, which is the place that she really wanted to study in terms of Vodun rituals. Yes, Remy is saying, yes, they can take us out of Africa, but they can't take the Africa out of us. Spirit is free. Yes, Eartha Kitt as well, who you'll see in that middle slide, taking one of Catherine Dunham's classes in the early 1950s in New York. Does anybody recognize in that middle photo the student behind Eartha Kitt in the black t-shirt? James Dean, also a student of Catherine Dunham, the Dunun Technique, this idea of movement, undulations, both African in origins, as Dunham said she saw in her studies and in her field work across the Caribbean, and also in ballet. So you see here in that photo, at the bottom in the middle, that's the back of Catherine Dunham teaching a class where they're using that European bar, and there he is in the black t-shirt as well. This is also in the 1950s in New York. So Dunham is not only a researcher, a dancer, a performer, but also this person who is literally giving an intellectual framework and a scholarly framework to the idea of diasporic culture. She taught at Southern Illinois University in the 1960s. That photograph that you see at the top right is her working as a student at Southern Illinois. And then at the bottom, again, to this point about her being someone who was performing African diasporic dance across the world. That photograph is at a reception in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, sometime between 1948 and 1954. You see Dunham at the far right near the bookcase, and she's there posed with some of her troupe members at the reception following their performance. She also traveled to Africa, to the African continent as a performer in the 1950s. And for a while, she also not only traveled to Africa, but she stayed at great periods in Senegal. John F. Kennedy, as president, appointed her as a cultural ambassador to Senegal. So she had reasons to be there and to set up a second home there. Kitsown, yes, African history is so much richer than we have been led to believe. Who would want to know? Who wouldn't want to know that James Dean studied with Catherine Dunham? I know, he got a lot going on there for James Dean, huh? All right, next slide. Systematic erasure of achievements of people of color. Yes, Dunham was friends with C.L.R. James and Grace Lee Pons, and was she is left wing? Yes. So in the slide that Demetrius brought up, you see that Catherine Dunham's troupe was produced by Saul Hurok, one of the major producers of theater and performing arts in the US from the 1940s onward. Here's an ad from a theater program for the Bal Negra that Dunham is advertising her school of dance and theater, which was located in New York in the 1940s after she finished at the University of Chicago. She did some traveling, as I said, in the Caribbean, and then went to New York, deciding to give up academia, deciding that she was going to be a performer as well as an ambassador and a student, a perpetual student of African dance. Yes, let's look at this one last image about Dunham to answer a question about her politics. So here's a t-shirt that is bearing a representation of political support for Haitian immigrants to the US that Dunham supported the ways in which Haitians were migrating to leave Haiti in search of a better life in the 1980s, but then we're meeting with a lot of racism and xenophobia in the United States. So she went on a hunger strike in the 1980s to protest the racism against these migrants. And she was on a hunger strike for 47 days to protest the treatment of Haitian refugees, and also later on in the 90s to protest the ouster of Jean-Bertrand Aristide as president of Haiti. We're getting close to 7:30, and what we can do is talk a little bit more about Catherine Dunham next week. That would be fine too. You should check out the links looking at her performances in Britain. In 1952, Dimitri just put in a link. And then there's also a link to Ballet Creole, another performance as well in the slides. So that'll go in. So just two more terms.
Get back. I don't want this.
There it is. So Dimitri's got those two links in there for you all to check out, and we can talk about them next week. But let's move on to the penultimate, the second to last term that I want us to think about as we think about the frameworks for this course. So this term, the MAFA or MAFA, also known as the African Holocaust, the Black Holocaust, and the Holocaust of enslavement. So this term is being positioned as a sort of replacement for Middle Passage and the Transatlantic slave trade. So the first bullet is a translation. So the Mafa is in Swahili, a phrase meaning the great disaster. Swahili being this language that is widespread, a trade language of East Africa. The next bullet point, as I said, is it's being seen as a description that in its force speaks more to this notion of the historical enslavement of African people and the trading of African people, as we've said, across the Sahara, across the Atlantic, across the Indian Ocean. And then in terms of the next bullet point, this term, the Mafak, appears in a book of 1988 by a social scientist named Let the Circle Be Unbroken, The Implications of African Spirituality in the Diaspora, published again in 1988 by the American Marimba Ani. And then we see it again in terms of a discussion about whether this term is right. The political scientist Malana Karenga, who has for many years taught in the Cal State system, if we go to the next bullet point, says that there's something about Mafa and this idea of disaster that doesn't sound intentional. So he's arguing that the idea should be the African Holocaust to speak of the historical enslavement of Blacks. And then people who are saying that whether we're talking about Mafa or we're talking about the African Holocaust, that there's this idea that we want to bring the critique of economic colonialism, imperialism, and oppression of people of African descent, not only historically, but in the final bullet point, seeing it as something that we're with in the present, that this idea of the Mafa is continual, constant, complete, a total system of human negation and nullification that doesn't, of course, stop at the end of the Atlantic slave trade, but instead goes into the present. And this is something that scholars have argued. So when I was looking at some things about Mafa, if we could go to the next slide, I noticed that the Art Gallery of Ontario in Toronto had this title for the presentation of the late artist Denise Tomasos's work, Dismantle #2. And we can hit the Advance, Dimitri, and hit it one more time. So this rather large painting by Tomasos called Dismantled Number 2 is a work that they at the Art Gallery of Toronto are saying is in a way representing Mafa. So Tomasos, if we could hit the next slide, was a Trinidadian-born artist who came to Canada in the 1970s as a child and then studied both art history and studio art at the University of Toronto, got a BA there, and then went on to Yale to get an MFA in painting from that very high-profile program. And then in the mid-1990s, she taught at the Tyler School of Art in Philadelphia, as well as at Rutgers. And in talking about her work, and you can hit the next slide, advance, Dimitri. You know, what she's talking about in this quote is that, you know, she's doing painting that is figuratively abstract, but in some ways represents and reflects upon this idea of confinement. And her whole thinking was about the confinement of, obviously, the slave holes on ships transporting captured and enslaved Africans off of the continent, to say nothing of the confinement of the modern prison, the confinement of the burial site in which African peoples were laid to rest. And so she thought about these ideas of these sort of boxes, these sort of almost like coffin-like spaces, these spaces in which one can't imagine breathing, much less surviving and thriving. And if we go on to the next slide, we can see the scale of her work here in an installation, 2 installation photos of her work on exhibition. And this was a posthumous exhibition in 2013 of her work in Canada at the McLaren Center. So you get a sense of the scale of her work from these installation photos. And then the last thing that I'll want to say too, in terms of key terms, if we go to the final slide, is that, you know, when we often see the word African American art, I like to flip that script and talk about art by African Americans. And I'm sure this will be a rich topic of discussion for all of us who are on this program tonight, this call, is to think about, you know, is there this thing that all artists of African descent who live in the US, is there something that's unified, the same, almost template-like in the work? And this is from people who were alive at the time of the United States formation in the 18th century to the present. So let's think about that as we're moving forward. You're going to look at some of the performances by Catherine Dunham. You're going to also check out the Zora Neale Hurston Negro characteristics of Negro expression writing, and you know, we can pick up and talk more about some examples of other people, especially visual artists, making interventions in terms of researching the African diaspora and bringing it into their work as something that is both historical, but also something that can be symbolic and aestheticized. So thanks very much, everybody. You guys have a lovely evening, and maybe even a January 21st if there's anybody who's across the timeline. And I look forward to seeing you next week, 6 p.m. Pacific. I'm really excited.
Thank you, Jackie. This was awesome. I will send links out to everyone, and thanks so much. We'll see you next week.